Is that really so hard, Sega? Okay, guys, so let me tell you guys a little story about how Enemy Zero was first unveiled to the world. It was Sony's press conference over in Japan, and Kenji Eno of Warp Games presents Enemy Zero, the follow up to his horror masterpiece D, which was also released on the Sega Saturn, is worthy of mention. After the trailer was said and done, it ended on the image of the PlayStation logo, but rather than cutting away, the PlayStation logo slowly morphs into the Sega Saturn logo, and then Kenji Eno announces to the world that Enemy Zero would be exclusive to the Sega Saturn at Sony's press conference. Supposedly, Kenji Eno was frustrated with Sony because pre-orders called for a certain amount of copies of D for the PlayStation, and Sony did not meet that demand. So he decided to just give them the proverbial middle finger at their own press conference. It's one of the great legends of Kenji Eno, and as Uncle Derek put it, he didn't just burn bridges, he nuked the friggin' bridge. But anyway, Enemy Zero. So the 32-bit era was really when horror games started to get into high gear. Resident Evil, need I say more? The Sega Saturn actually did get Resident Evil, but it wasn't as good as the PlayStation version. And because, the Saturn was so difficult to program for, a lot of the famous horror games that were coming out on the PlayStation didn't make it to the Sega Saturn. So there was no Silent Hill, there was no Dino Crisis, no Parasite Eve. So there were a couple of other games that tried to copy Resident Evil, but none of them did very well. But probably the most famous piece of horror on the Sega Saturn would have to be Enemy Zero, which is sort of a spiritual successor to Kenji Eno's previous work, which was a little game called D. What exactly ties the games together? Well, Enemy Zero centers around a researcher by the name of Laura. Laura being a digital actress that also appeared in D. Though they share the same name, the two characters, D and Enemy Zero, they are unrelated, and just share a similar character model, which is the main convention that ties all these games together. Anyway, in the game, Laura is part of the crew of a research vessel that's on its way back to Earth, but en route, something breaks out of the cargo hold and starts to wreak havoc on the ship. Laura quickly discovers that whatever came from the cargo hold is some kind of alien life that is not only vicious, bloodthirsty, and on the hunt, but also invisible. So now Laura has to get things under control before the ship makes it back to Earth and these monsters are set loose upon humanity. The plot of Enemy Zero, it's indicative of something like Aliens, which I'm sure Kenji Eno would be disgusted with me for mentioning, but there's nothing wrong with something being cliche as long as it's done well, and it's done really well in Enemy Zero. Especially for a horror video game, because unlike a lot of games at the time, when you come across a big bombshell, Laura actually reacts to what happens in the game, whereas in Resident Evil you come across a big bombshell, the characters don't react unless they happen to be in a cutscene. So, there is a bit more emotion to this one, I would say. And the aliens are also pretty freaky too, and I think part of the reason Eno decided to make them invisible was because the story that the xenomorph in the original Alien only had maybe 15-20 minutes of screen time in the original movie. So he thought he could take that a step further by making aliens that you can't really see. And that actually works to the game's favor, because you only get these fleeting glimpses of the aliens. What they really look like is left to your own imagination, and that just makes them infinitely more frightening. The presentation's also top-notch. The 3D sections, the full 3D sections, are pretty basic, all things considered. But given the enclosed nature of the environments, it actually does work pretty effectively. Also leverages some of the limitations of the hardware in favor of the gameplay. And the CGI cutscenes, like you're seeing here, are also pretty well done, though they are obviously dated. It still looks pretty good, and there's lots of moody lighting, some great camera effects. The first-person stuff is great. Obviously, carryover from D, which was completely like that. And the soundtrack is just fantastic. That's another great story about this game. There was evidently a famous composer who was in Japan at the time, doing a bit of charity work, and Kenji Eno was desperate to get him to compose some music for the game. So he basically cornered him at his hotel room and refused to let him go back to his hotel room until they brokered a deal for him to work on the game, which does not surprise me. Like, I love stories about Kenji Eno. He was just such a fascinating individual when it comes to game design. But as for the gameplay itself in Enemy Zero, it is what I would classify as survival horror. It does meet a lot of the core tenets I tend to associate with the genre. There is combat, there is resource management, and exploration is key, stuff like that. Though Enemy Zero is a weird beast when it comes to gameplay. So, for starters, no matter what, Lore can only take a single hit, so everything in this game is a one-hit kill. Now, that might be broken, seem broken, especially considering that a big part of most survival horror games is that, you manage your health. However, in Enemy Zero, all the enemies die in one hit as well. Early on, you get your hands on a energy pistol that you can use to take out the enemies, and they all die in one hit, so it might sound balanced, but they're definitely stacking the odds against you, because there are lots of limitations on the combat here. For starters, it's not as simple as just pointing it towards the enemy and pulling the trigger. The weapon has a charge-up period, and it's not as simple as just holding the button and letting the gun go off. You actually have to let the button go once it reaches a certain point in the charge in order to fire. And if you hold it for too long, you're going to short out your gun and you're going to waste ammo. So that's something to consider. The other thing to consider is that the weapon is incredibly short range. You basically have to be within arm's reach of whatever you're shooting at in order to hit it. So that's something else to consider. And then, of course, the enemies are invisible. So it's not as simple as just watching them and letting them come at you. How you keep track of the aliens in this game is you have a motion sensor that, gives off a ping, with the ping increasing in frequency the closer you are to the enemies. And honestly, that just creates this really intense horror experience, because you hear that ping, you start to get a little nervous because there's something nearby. It starts picking up in pace, so it's coming at you, so you get your gun out. It's still coming, so you point it, you start to charge because you think it's within range, and as you're about to let off that trigger, you are just praying that whatever you're pointing that thing is within range, because if you miss that shot, more than likely you're dead meat. So it's just, man, it's such a cool experience. However, there is one problem with it, and that's really the save system that they have in place. So how it works here is Laura has like a PDA of sorts that she can use to save anywhere in the game. Now, that might sound like a good thing, especially compared to the typewriters in Resident Evil. But the problem is the PDA only holds so much charge, and if you use up all the charges, you won't be able to save your game. So you gotta ration that, much like you would the ink ribbons in Resident Evil. But that also means that you're gonna go long stretches of gameplay without being able to save. So if you make a mistake, you get killed by one of the aliens, sorry, you're gonna have to do it all again. So it's such an interesting, it's just such a fascinating design, but it's also the game's biggest enemy too. I can see this game being extremely frustrating for a lot of people, but people who are able to stick with it, they are going to find something really special. It's definitely not for everyone, but it is still worth looking up. Enemy Zero, from what I understand, was actually pretty successful as far as Sega Saturn games go. But, you know, by this point, the Sega Saturn was on the decline, so probably didn't mean a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. It probably did well for Warp. They probably didn't put a whole lot of money into the game. But at the end of the day, it's still a classic by the standards of the Saturn. After Enemy Zero, Kenji Eno would start work on D2, which, despite the title, also has nothing to do with the original D or Enemy Zero. Is, you know, just another game that stars Laura, the digital actress. And that was initially going to be for the M2, which was going to be the successor to the 3DO, which never came out. So he moved development to the Sega Dreamcast. And while D2 would also be sort of this bizarre masterpiece as well, Genji Eno thought that he was becoming a little too conventional, so after D2, he sort of stepped away from game design for a while. He would actually pass away a few years ago. He actually passed away a few years ago, and he definitely left a very interesting legacy in regards to game design. This wasn't a guy who really was interested in mainstream success, high sales, or anything like that. He just wanted to make games, and he didn't care if people thought they were weird or not. So, yeah, check out Enemy Zero if you got a Saturn, and also check out D as well. That version on the Saturn is great as well. Both of these are horror masterpieces, and, you know, it's not like you have much else to play in that genre on the console anyway. But that's going to do it for Enemy Zero, guys. Join me tomorrow as we continue on with the retrospective.